Everybody. As Ruth mentioned, I'll be giving the presentation today in English because we have a multilingual audience today. I will try to go slowly to give the translators time to do their work. I do speak Spanish also, so if the Spanish speakers want something clarified in their language, please don't hesitate to put a message in the chat and Ruth will interrupt me. So as Ruth said, we are talking about heat stress today and protecting the workforce from that. Let me just close. I can't see very well in this format, so I'm just going to close my, there we go. Oops, pardon me. I don't know why my computer. So why are we talking about heat stress? Everybody knows climate change is here. The world is warming, but that is not the only thing that we are worried about. Part of global warming is that the heat waves that every part of the world is experiencing are longer and more frequent. So we have these sustained heat waves that really are going to have an impact on everybody, but specifically our workforce. These are just some headlines that I pulled from the last couple of weeks from the news. This is pervasive everywhere. I know there was massive heat waves in Mexico. There was massive heat waves throughout the United States. India and the Middle East had a horrible one. People who were just sitting outside, not even actively moving, like the folks who are working, were having heat-related events. And like I said, these kinds of heat waves are going to become longer and more frequent. Another reason that this is important to talk about now is that regulations are changing. This is because this is such a pervasive circumstance that we are living through. The European Union has already introduced some new regulations on how to address heat stress in the workplace. So any product that's coming into the EU is going to be have these standards imposed upon them, and the ILO is currently revising their heat stress guidelines, as well as a few other regulators. OSHA is doing theirs. NIOSH is doing theirs. So I think this is something that it's important to get ahead as the regulatory framework changes around the world. Further, the impact that that's going to have on the global workforce is enormous. The equivalent, these high prolonged temperatures are going to cause the equivalent of 80 million jobs lost. That's 2.2% of working hours worldwide will be reduced because of this increase of temperatures worldwide. That is huge. And of course, this doesn't just affect sugar. Sugar is one of the most affected industries because of how difficult the work is. But really, any place that you see this intersection of high heat, strenuous work, and insufficient labor protections, you will find people in high risk for illness and injury, and even death due to heat exposure. That said, agriculture is the most impacted industry. According to this ILO report, 60% of the jobs that are affected will be within the agricultural sector. So it's important to understand what the mechanisms are and what we can do to prevent it and protect your workforce. Oops, sorry, animated here. There are lots of scientific publications by my group and by others that are linking heat stress, specifically in the sugar industry, but also beyond, to diseases like chronic kidney disease. So again, the data is there, the precedent is there, the situation is there, and we will talk a little bit more about what it is. I'm sorry, my slideshow is a little janky today. It seems to be going ahead on its own. So what is heat stress? When I'm talking about heat stress, I think most people think about just the heat outside, the weather. That's part of it. The humidity, the temperature, the solar radiation. That is, of course, part of it. But what I am talking about in addition is the internal heat that the body generates from muscular work. This is called metabolic load. Anybody who's ever done any exercise knows what that is. When you start exercising, when you move your body, when you move your muscles, your body gets hot. The combination of what happens when you move your body and that muscular workload, that internal heat generation, combined with external heat or the climate heat, is when we are in increased danger for a heat-related event. Humans in general are pretty bad at cooling ourselves down. We're good at heating ourselves up, but the only way that we have to cool our bodies down is by our blood vessels dilating to get the blood that's circulating through our body close to our skin, in the hope that a breeze will come by, hit the sweat on our bodies and cool the blood that's circulating down. Panting, breathing heavily, sweating, and resting. That is the only way that we can cool down our bodies. So again, it makes environmental heat stress, internal heat from muscular work, that combination is a dangerous combination for humans, because we do not have the biological capacity to self-regulate on our own, and we are very good at ignoring the signs that our bodies give us when we are getting too hot. So when we're talking about heat-related events, especially in the workforce, there are two different kinds. And I think that most often when you're talking about heat strokes, people assume that it's this one on the left. This is a little bit clinical and medical, but I did want to show you the difference. What I am talking about is an exertional heat stroke. So this is a heat-related event, a heat stroke that is caused by strenuous exercise. It affects a different population. Heat stroke generally affects elderly or people who are sick. The articles that I showed in the beginning of the presentation of folks who were just kind of not doing much activity and having a heat stroke that caused death most likely fell into this category. Exertional heat stroke, what we are worried about in our workforce, has different symptoms. And if you just look at like a catalog of what is going on, sometimes this is missed. And I think the most common one here is sweating. So people who are having a regular heat stroke, like their bodies are just getting too hot, usually one of the signs of that is that they stop sweating or they're not sweating. In our workforce, in the population of interest for this call, they are often sweating quite profusely. So when health promoters are looking, they're often using this criteria to determine if it's an emergency, when really they should be using this criteria on the right to determine if it's an emergency in the field. We can talk more about that later. There we go. So again, just a little bit more about what heat stress is. There's the internal factors and the external factors that I just mentioned. I'll just in more detail talk about what those are. The external factors are the air temperature and wind speed, the relative humidity. Those are the things, when you hear a weather report, they say the sensation, the weather, the heat sensation. So there could be a number on the thermometer, but it actually feels hotter because of the humidity or the wind speed, for example. Heavy workload and piece rate is an external factor. As I mentioned, we as humans are very good at overriding our body's natural signs telling us that we need to slow down or take a break. When workers are assigned a specific amount that they need to cut in a day or in a given period of time, people are incentivized to work beyond their physical capacity. So this is a big component of what could cause a heat stress event. The lack of natural shade and exposed land area. A lot of cane is grown in volcanic soil, which is dark. It absorbs the solar radiation and radiates it back. That makes things hotter. And then clothing. Clothing could be a really important tool to help us regulate our body temperature, but it can also block our body's natural defenses. Pesticide applicators, for example, are required to wear plastic or impermeable materials. And that is going to stop their body from, it's going to insulate the body, and it's going to stop the sweat from being evaporated, which will cause people to overheat. The internal factors are dehydration. I think everybody knows what that is. The metabolic load, which I mentioned earlier, that's the amount of energy required to move your muscles. Health conditions, such as if you have high blood pressure or low blood pressure. I mentioned early on that when we get hot, our veins are dilating. So if you have low blood pressure and all of a sudden your veins have opened up, then your blood pressure is going to drop even more. And you could have, it makes it much more likely that you will have a heat stress event. The same with high blood pressure, actually. Sex. Women are slightly better at regulating our body temperatures, but slightly better. Men tend to have more muscle mass, so they get hotter as they're moving around. But also things like pregnancy. If you have a pregnant women tend to run a slight temperature. Their body temperatures are naturally a little bit higher. So if you are going to a field, this is touching on the next one, fever. If you are going to the fields with a temperature, with a slightly elevated body temperature, it is bringing you closer to a dangerous threshold, because what we are worried about is our internal body temperature is getting too hot. So if your body temperature is already too hot, and then you're exposed to the external factors, and then you start exercising and moving your body, and your body temperature goes up even higher, you are starting at a disadvantage and are more likely to have a heat stress event. So this clearly has an impact beyond the individual. I think the individual impact is pretty clear. Acute illnesses, accidents. Heat stress has been associated with an increase of all accidents, not just, the classic fainting, vomiting, heat stroke and death, like cuts and vehicle accidents and falls. Every kind of work-related accident is more likely to happen in an ambient of heat stress. And then, of course, long-term illnesses like chronic kidney disease and death. The impact on society, I think, is important to mention. If people are working in these kinds of heat stress conditions, there is a decrease in productivity, the reduced potential labor hours, not just for illness, but physically it's impossible to work if you are overheated. So that is an important thing that we're going to talk about a little bit later, is the when we talk about the return on investment of doing heat stress mitigation and prevention. And then if you have workers who are sick, who do develop a chronic illness or are in need of health services, or you have folks who are dropping out because the work is too difficult, and you have a huge turnover of employees. These are things that are going to impact the society at large. If you have healthy men dropping out of the workforce because they are too sick to work or have died, that of course also has an important impact on society. As I'm giving these talks, a question that I frequently get is, why now that people have been working very hard in high heat for the history of humanity? These are kind of the highlights of why now. I think the most important one is probably it always has happened and nobody was paying attention. especially in the case of sugarcane in the Americas, there's a history of slavery here, and it's still vulnerable populations who are doing a lot of the field work, and so nobody was really looking. Piecework, I already mentioned, I think is a really important component here, and that is linked to the industrialization and the rise of monocultures in agriculture. The way that we do this kind of work has changed. People have less control over their day and their work. And so the combination of that with this piece rate work, I think, incentivizes people to work beyond their capacities. And then, of course, the warming climate that we already spoke about. And this is just to show that this is not new. This is some data that we pulled from Costa Rica from 1970 to 2012. This green line is the land under cane, so how much sugarcane was cultivated in Costa Rica, and this blue line was the increase of mortality of CKD, CKDU, chronic kidney disease of non-traditional causes. This is a clear association between the heavy work in sugarcane and an increased mortality. So just to say that CKD is one of the indicators that work conditions are causing the workers to have heat-related events chronically over the course of months and months and months. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but this is just to show this isn't new. And I picked Costa Rica, but I could have chosen dozens of other countries. Now I'm going to show you what we do about it. We together with Bonsucro and Ingenio San Antonio in Nicaragua, started the Adelante Initiative. Ingenio San Antonio has been established as a center of excellence. We studied over the course of the last 7 years, close to 5,000 field workers now. We did a lot of research and a lot of support, just looking at how to manage the core temperatures of the workers' bodies, increase hydration, create a program of adherence to the interventions that we were implementing, and then supporting behavioral change on an organizational level. So not just of the workers, but from upper management down to the work captains, down to the actual workers. We use the philosophy of assess, address, and assist. This is what we do with any new partner who is interested in implementing heat stress prevention. We go in, we see what the work looks like. We work with the company to address the gaps. I'm sorry, there's a typo here. This would say to address the gaps. And then beyond that, we help support implementation. So if there are issues, if there are situations that make the implementation of interventions difficult, we work with them, with the producers or the mills to close those gaps and make it a sustainable, successful program. One of the reasons that we started this initiative with Bonsucro and Ingenio San Antonio was the realization that the current guidelines for protection were paradoxically too much for the sugar context and not enough. What do I mean by that? This graph on the left is temperatures during the course of a workday. This solid blue line is the average, and the dotted line is the maximum range and the minimum range. These dotted red lines are the required rest based on the OSHA standards. So I'm just going to use the maximum temperature on the days that we measured to give you the examples. At 7 a.m. in this place, the WGBT, which is an index, it's a combination of different factors like humidity, wind speed, solar radiation, and natural temperature. By 7 a.m., the temperature's index was 27 degrees. So OSHA mandates that requires 15 minutes of rest for every hour worked. That's at 7 a.m. By 9 a.m., that index was reading 33 degrees, which by OSHA standards meant that you could no longer work, that's 9 a.m. And that's not reasonable in the sugar context. Paradoxically, we set people, we were measuring people's internal body temperatures. We saw that folks were getting really, really hot the first hour of the day. Internal body temperatures between the hours of 6 and 7, when the temperatures were coolest, is when people started spiking temperatures. So a 15-minute break at 7 a.m. really didn't protect that person from getting too hot. So we saw that in the sugar context, we needed to adapt interventions that were relevant, that were feasible, and that people could, that the whole industry could kind of get behind, so that cane could be harvested and all of the different field activities around that could occur while keeping workers safe. So this is, I'm going to zoom through here. So the first step of that was measuring the work intensity, because as I said, exertional heat stress is about the effort that it takes to move your muscles. So we employed some sports physiologists, because the manual sugarcane cutters really are extreme athletes, and this is kind of showing that all of us sitting at this desk today, just watching my presentation, are probably have a max heart rate hovering around 20% right now. Over the course of a work day, the sugarcane cutters were about 60% over the course of their day, which was comparable to these other activities. Military operations, this was a 7-day training exercise in the US military. Marathons, which you know, and the ultra endurance races, which are like multi-day extreme marathons, running through the desert or up volcanoes or through a mountain range. But it's important to mention that these other 3 activities that had the same levels of exertion also were surrounded by a lot of protection. So these folks all have a really high level of nutrition. They are probably getting nutrition that's specific to the very high exertional activities that they are participating in. They also have a lot of rest and recovery time before and after these moments of exertion. Whereas sugarcane cutters are working, where we measured, they were only working 5.5 hours. Most places are working closer to 10 to 12 hours a day, for 6 days a week, 6-ish months a year, with no rest or recovery, just every single day, pretty much running a marathon, an ultra marathon. Whereas, these folks, this is once a year. These military training operations are once a year. A marathon could be once in a lifetime, or maybe once a year if somebody likes running marathons, and the same with the ultra marathons. It's usually once a year or once in a lifetime. So just to kind of wrap your mind around how hard these guys are working and why it's so important to take care of their health. And if you think of them as extreme athletes, then maybe that connection becomes a little bit more clear. This is just a visual representation of their heart rate over the course of the day. And I really like this because we implemented hourly rest breaks, and you can see very clearly in this graph how effective a short 10-minute break, a little bit longer over here in this hotter parts of the day, how effective it is at immediately getting your heart rate down. And then I have these lines just to, we smooth out just to show a different way of what the exertion level is for the different kinds of activities. Again, a different way of seeing the intensity versus frequency. You know, again, with the tropical beach vacation, you could be pretty hot lying on the beach, but the work intensity is pretty low, whereas these guys are kind of on the other opposite with a high frequency and a high intensity of work for long periods of time with inadequate nutrition in most cases and no recovery time. So now the important part, what to do about it. Ruth, I see that there might be some activity in the chat. Should I take a pause here and answer some questions, or should I keep going?
Hi, Ilana. No, there is a question. It says, ¿qué cantidad de agua es la recomendada por jornada laboral para un cortador de caña? Y también, muy similar, ¿qué cantidad de suero es recomendable para la ingesta de un cortador de caña? Sería cantidad de agua y cantidad de suero.
Okay. Thank you, Ruth. Gracias por las preguntas. The question was about hydration, recommended water and hydration solution, and I am just about to tell you that. So I'll just keep going, and if you have questions, once I get to that slide, I'll take a pause, and Ruth can let me know if questions.
Sí. Y perdón, nada más recordándoles que de preferencia pongan sus preguntas en el área de Q&A para también poderles dar un mejor seguimiento. Gracias.
Gracias, Ruth. Okay, so to address heat stress amongst sugarcane workers, we've developed this rest, shade, hydration, sanitation system. And I will walk you through that right now. Mandatory rest in shade is clave, key. If you tell people that they can rest whenever they want, they won't do it. Not because they don't care about themselves, but it's just not part of the way that that work is done. So especially, it's a hard sell that at 7 o'clock in the morning, when it's still cool, you need to take a little bit of a break and get your temperature, your body temperature down. But remember, in the graph that I showed you a couple slides back, because of the human body's circadian rhythm, and because of the way that we move our bodies, and then this internal heat stress is generated, mornings are one of the most dangerous times for a heat stress related event. In fact, the US military has published several papers about how those early morning hours, again, because of the circadian rhythms of our bodies, those morning hours are high risk. So you need to interrupt the work in the morning, give folks a little bit of a break, and let them get their heart rate down and therefore their body temperature down. These breaks should be in shade. We recommend shade tents that are portable, that move with the guys in the fields. But natural shade is also absolutely perfect. This is the rest schedule that we developed with Ingenio San Antonio. We did an assessment of the different kinds of field work that they have and came up with a different scheme for each one of them. So burned cane cutters or green cane cutters, which are the seed cutters in this case, are the highest level of workload. Their workload is extremely heavy. And you can see starting at 7 a.m., we have a 10-minute break. In Ingenio San Antonio, they have the policy that this hard work stops at noon. We'll show you later that this has not, they used to go all the way to 2, actually. They used to go all the way to 4, 20 years ago. I'll show you later that stopping at noon with this regular rest schedule did not impact productivity at all. Well, it impacted it in a positive way. People are producing slightly more with this rest schedule. Seed cutters, which is a similar amount of physical exertion, work slightly longer days because at this mill, at least, the morning hours are spent cutting, and the afternoon, they just bag the seed that they have cut, and it's a less rigorous activity. So they work a little bit longer, but you can see that in these hottest hours of the day, they're taking longer breaks. And then other field jobs like drip irrigation repair, seeders, reseeding, all of the other different field work that are at a kind of a more moderate level of workload. They also work longer days, and this is the rest schedule we developed with them. We can talk more about that in a bit. As I mentioned, we recommend mobile shade tents. If you have a 10-minute break and you have to walk 500 meters through a cane field, which is tricky to walk through, your body temperature and your heart rate are actually not going to go down. So the rest needs to be, the shaded rest needs to be close to where these guys are working. So we developed together with San Antonio these lightweight yet durable portable shade tents. They need to have 3 walls, so a roof and 2 sides, because you're working in the morning when the sun is rising and is on the horizon. So you need the wall to block the sun in the morning. And then as the sun rises during midday, you need the protection from above. The material needs to be permeable so that the wind can blow through, because as I mentioned early on, one of the best ways to cool our body is to have the perspiration, the sweat evaporate. And so while people are resting, if a breeze can come through and help the sweat evaporate, that only helps to lower body temperature. We also recommend seated rest. So in this Ingenio, they have some stools in these shade tents. And you need to have enough space for workers to sit comfortably. Anybody who has been in a crowded elevator in a hot place knows, we radiate heat out of our body. And so if you are in a really tight space with lots of people who are radiating heat, you're actually not going to be able to cool down as effectively. We also recommend to put water containers in the water so that folks can refill their personal water bottles, and spend the time resting, hydrating, or sharpening their machetes, eating, whatever they want to do during their break. Have that there available to them. We also, in this Ingenio, they have a cooler of sueros or hydration beverages available for workers to drink during their breaks. We recommend that it's no more than 50 meters away from where workers are, so that they can, as I said, enjoy the duration of their break seated and in the shade and hydrating. Now to hydration, the question that everybody wanted. This is trickier. The kind of general recommendation is that for heavy workload, folks should be drinking about 1 liter of water per hour and 1 unit of an electrolyte solution per hour. So that's about 250 milliliters of a hydration beverage. That said, we can't force people to drink. Every human has their own hydration kind of requirements. So this is just when you're calculating how much water you want to have in the field, you want to calculate 1 unit per hour per worker, or 250 milliliters of hydration solution per worker per hour over the course of the workday, so that you have enough water in the field so that the folks can hydrate and refill their water bottles. We also recommend that the water is in an insulated container, both the personal water bottles and the bigger reserves, because it's more likely folks will drink it if it is at least at room temperature and not super hot after being exposed to the sun all day in metal containers, for example. And of course, the water provided needs to be clean and safe. If we are asking folks to drink in the field, then to hydrate, then sanitation should also be provided, especially where there are women working in the field. We found time and time again, women workers were not drinking because it wasn't safe for them to relieve themselves afterwards. So this is an example of what Ingenio San Antonio did in their field, just a simple pit latrine close to where they're working so that everybody has a safe place to relieve themselves, but especially some more vulnerable populations of workers. Some other factors to consider: acclimatization. Every worker who is entering the field for the first time or after a prolonged absence should have a period of acclimatization. The standard is about 2 weeks of incremental work. So that is to just get your body used to the conditions of working in the heat and working hard in the heat. So over the course of 2 weeks, you increment slowly the amount of hours working and the amount of tons of cane cuts or area of cane cuts over the course of these 2 weeks. And that, again, if somebody has a prolonged absence due to illness or whatever, when they re-enter the field, they should do a second acclimatization period. I think the other two I've spoken about already. The importance of a good implementation. Mandatory rest breaks, shade and water seem very simple, but we understand that in the sugarcane context, it is actually operationally and logistically quite complex. And so there needs to be a good implementation. We have seen dozens of examples of where people have invested in the components of an intervention, but for all intents and purposes, there is no intervention. People are not taking the rest. The shade is inadequate. The water is located in a place that's too far away for people to refill during the course of the day. So a good implementation of an intervention is the key to a successful intervention, which is the key to a healthy workforce. To highlight that, I have this example. On the left side, you see a place with no intervention. This is looking at internal body temperature over the course of a workday. So this first one is a place that has no intervention. You can see that the workers, their body temperature, as I mentioned, it spikes immediately. It goes up right away. This red line is the average. This the range here is the actual temperature. So these are the maximum temperatures, and this is the minimum temperatures. This is about 20 workers over the course of a day. So I'm going to just look at the maximum because you actually have to worry about the worst case scenario in your workers. So in a place with no intervention, you can see they work very long days. They actually work past 5 o'clock, but the apparatus that we were using to measure had a short battery life and the battery died at around 5 o'clock. So you can imagine that this will continue. Their temperature spikes very early in the day and pretty much stays high for the day. You can see that they take about an hour rest for lunch, where the body temperature goes down beautifully over the course of that rest. But then as soon as they start working again, their body temperature goes above 38 degrees. 38 degrees Celsius, as you know, is a fever. If you are working with a fever, you are at high risk of a heat stress event, and you are likely having kidney injury over the course of this day. An incident of kidney injury, acute kidney injury, is happening if you are working for prolonged time with a fever. So you can see that these folks spent 2 hours of their day with a body temperature over 38 degrees. They had 60 minutes of rest, and at the end of the safra, we measured them in the beginning of the safra, and at the end of the safra, 21% of their workforce had kidney injury. People who started healthy had kidney injury, worrisome kidney injury at the end of their safra. This is a place that had some intervention, but it was insufficient and not well implemented. You can see they had 2 rest breaks, but they were not that long over the course of the day. Again, their temperatures are getting really, really hot very early in the morning. They spent 90 minutes of their day with a fever. They spent about an hour resting, and they had between 14 and 50% kidney injury over the course of the harvest. This last one is at Ingenio San Antonio that has a good, well-implemented intervention. You can see how beautifully these early morning rests successfully keep the temperature below 38 degrees for most of the day, you can see that we still have some work to do. These may be individuals that require extra attention. You know, everybody's body is different. Everybody's heat threshold is different. So we still have some room for improvement here, but you can see that 32 minutes of the day were spent over 38 degrees Celsius. They spent a significant amount of their workday resting, and that at the end of the SAFA, there was only 1% of kidney injury, which again, we want that number to be 0, but just a order of magnitude better than this one, which is an order of magnitude better than this one. This is again kind of underlining and putting an exclamation point on why it's important to have a good implementation. Not forcing people. I'll give 3 examples from 3 different countries of interpretations of this intervention that actually made things worse for the workers instead of helping them. In one operation, they really hyper-focused on hydration. Workers were forced to drink 10 liters a day, and the people who drank the most got some sort of bonus. And then here you had several people hospitalized for overhydration, which can also cause death and illness. So you never want to force people to drink. You want to encourage them to drink, give them every opportunity to drink, but you cannot force them to drink. Another place in another country increased the workday by the exact amount of minutes that they put on their agenda for rest. And so that had a very negative effect because it was just extending the workday into the hottest hours and actually making the guys work harder. So it was self-defeating. And then in another place, in another country, they were pulling people out from the nice natural shade that they had around this cane field. I know not all fields have trees and shade, but this one did. And they were having people walk very long distances to the shade tents that they were providing, which was also counterproductive for the reasons we've already mentioned. So again, emphasis on design and implementation is key for success. And then continuous monitoring. I think you guys understand from that last slide. This chart is to show the increase in productivity and return on investment for interventions that are done well and sustainably implemented. So this is again from Ingenio San Antonio, starting in 2012 when they are working an 8-hour workday. This is just hours worked. So you can see at the end with our kind of complete intervention, they were working a total of 4.7 hours a day, including the rest breaks. This green line is the amount of cane cut, so tons per hour per worker. So you can see a beautiful association between shorter work days, great rest schedule, increased productivity. I mean, these are exhausted workers cutting 0.8 tons per day, and these are well-rested, hydrated, healthy workers cutting 1.57 tons per hour. It's really impressive. And this is just a different way of seeing it. This was the total average per day per worker. So 6.59 tons per day in the best intervention circumstances, which is comparable to an 8-hour workday. So they are working almost half the time, cutting slightly more. And when we did the financial return on investment with our economists, we discovered a 22% return on investment. These were the factors that were considered in calculating the return on investment. The lower staff turnover reduces in absenteeism, reduces in accidents, reduces in hospital care. Ingenio San Antonio has its own hospital and clinic that attends its workers. So less accidents meant less spending from the hospital side, the well-being of their workers, and they qualified for better terms from 2 different investment banks because they had this focus on worker health. And I think that's an important incentive for all of you folks. This was just another way to show the productivity increase of a good rested worker versus an exhausted, dehydrated worker. That working about 4 hours a day, they were cutting 6.2 tons compared to a place with no intervention, working 9 hours a day, producing far less. Again, beyond the epidemiology and the physiology and the actual interventions, we understand that this is kind of a paradigm shift in a lot of operations. So we work very hard to make sure that occupational health and safety is just part of doing business. If it is part of doing business, from the top levels of management to harvest and the agricultural departments to the work captains to the workers, it's just how business is done. And it makes it easier, but we understand that that is behavioral change is necessary. And so communication, sharing of information, regular monitoring and check-in and support between the different departments of an ingenio or association or whatever is very important and a key to success. So I think I will end it here and open it up to your questions, if you have any.
Muchísimas gracias, Ilana. Sí tenemos algunas preguntas. Bueno, primero no sé si quieres, yo sé que pasaste ya por el tema del agua, pero como estaban las preguntas puntuales, si quisieras, pues más que nada, reforzar la cantidad de agua recomendada y la cantidad de suero recomendable, así como si es viable tomar el suero diariamente.
Okay. And I think I will do it in Spanish, if that's okay, Ruth and translators. Como las preguntas me llegaron en español, les respondo en español. Como mencioné, la recomendación es 1 litro de agua por trabajador por hora y 250 mililitros de suero por hora por trabajador. Es una recomendación abierta, o sea, no se puede, como dije varias veces, no se puede esforzar a nadie tomar ni suero ni agua, pero la recomendación general es darles acceso a esta cantidad de agua. Sí se pueden tomar sueros diario, varias veces al día, pero nosotros enfocamos más en agua por hidratación porque los electrolitos se pueden consumir en comidas, por ejemplo, y los sueros tienen alta probabilidad de tener mucho azúcar y es importante hidratarse con poco azúcar. Entonces, azúcar puede ser dañino y sabemos que en esas poblaciones como le gustan dulce, está bien darles la opción, pero que la mayor cantidad de hidratación tiene que ser a través de agua.
Gracias, Ilana. Estoy hablando en mute. Adicionalmente, con estas preguntas, están preguntando también que relacionado al consumo de agua y suero, la alimentación de los mismos y su nutrición, ¿cómo se aborda? ¿Cómo han abordado el tema de la alimentación y nutrición, además de la hidratación?
Did the question come in English or Spanish?
Spanish.
Spanish. Ok, sigo en español. Sí, está bien con todos. Con nutrición es más complicado la respuesta. Sé que depende en la contratación de los trabajadores en su operación. Este sería una pregunta para una nutricionista, pero, o sea, realmente, como mostré en los gráficos, esas son atletas de alto rendimiento, entonces su dieta debe pertenecer a alguien que está corriendo un maratón diario. La gran mayoría de esos muchachos no están consumiendo ni cerca de 2,000 calorías al día. Entonces, un enfoque en subir calorías, subir proteínas, para que no están gastando su masa muscular cuando están trabajando. Pero hace falta hablar con una nutricionista para su población particular.
Gracias, Ilana. Ahora llegó una pregunta en portugués. Celia, si me puedes ayudar, por favor, está en el chat.
Ruth, maybe while she's translating into English or Spanish, is there another question I could answer?
Ilana, no sé si escuchaste, es que estaba en otro canal, pero aquí lo que están preguntando es cuáles serían las alternativas para los casos donde la topografía del área donde está sembrada la caña de azúcar imposibilita la sustitución de los cortadores de caña manual a corte mecanizado. ¿Y cuáles serían las consecuencias o cómo prevenir y minimizar estas consecuencias del calentamiento global? Si hay algún estudio para auxiliar a los productores en esta situación.
A ver si entiendo. O sea, en lugares donde no se puede mecanizar.
Exacto.
Ok. Esta es la pregunta que vino en portugués.
Vino en portugués.
Okay,
Sí.
so I respond in English, I suppose, to this one. This is precisely what the whole presentation of the water rest shade scheme is for manual workers in places where you do not have mechanized work. Even where you have mechanized work, you're going to need some sort of heat stress mitigations because there is a manual component in wherever you have mechanized work. Maybe not the guys sitting in the air-conditioned harvesters, but there are folks outside. This presentation was geared for manual work in fields where either mechanization isn't possible financially or topographically. The only way to prevent heat stress is by having regular rest breaks, starting first thing in the morning, every hour, to make sure that people keep their body temperature down over the course of the day. During heat waves and sustained periods of time where the heat is higher than usual, you may need to adapt and add additional protective measures. But the scheme that I spoke of here, that I laid out, is like the basic minimum requirement for manual field workers doing this kind of work. I am happy to refer you to some of our studies and some of the reports from international magazines and newspapers that kind of talk a little bit more about the concept. You can reach out to my email address is here. You can reach out to me if you'd like some more materials.
Gracias, Ilana. Ahora, bueno, primero, antes que nada, nos preguntan si se va a poder compartir esta presentación. Yo les recuerdo nada más que esta sesión está siendo grabada y después va a ser subida a nuestra página web, entonces van a poder tener acceso de volver a revisar esta presentación más adelante. Se van a publicar los links, entonces con eso no va a haber ningún problema. Y están entrando otras preguntas. Dice, ¿cuáles son los principales síntomas de estrés por calor o qué manifestaciones evidencia el afectado? ¿Cómo debemos atender a alguien que está afectado por una deshidratación severa en el lugar de trabajo? Y amarrada con esa, o sea, que viene sobre lo mismo, dice, ¿cómo debemos proceder con un trabajador que por deshidratación sufre calambres en el campo?
Ok. ¿En español o en inglés, Ruth?
En español entró.
Ok, los síntomas, hay como 15 síntomas comunes, pero o sea, cada individual puede exponer sus síntomas un poquito diferente. Como los más graves, o sea, vómitos, desmayos, como seizures, o sea, cuando se cae y temblan, calambres, picadura, mucha sed, mucha sed, mareos. A ver, estos son como los principales síntomas. Creo que cuando orinan, eh, duele cuando orinan, también, por ejemplo. Mucho cansancio, o sea, una cansancio extrema, o sea, que la lengua se pega al paladar. Esos son ejemplos de cómo puede ser alguien que está pasando por un evento de estrés térmico. Tener termómetros en campo para tomar la temperatura de alguien es una buena herramienta para ver en el momento si alguien está demasiado caliente, o sea, fiebre, o sea, es que tienen fiebre. Si alguien tiene un evento de un golpe de calor o asolación o un desmayo, o sea, si tiene un evento en campo, hay que enfriar su cuerpo, o sea, ponerlas en sombra. O sea, depende en la gravedad del evento. Si están conscientes, o sea, hay que bajar la temperatura del cuerpo, hay que poner como toallas mojadas aquí en el cuello, ponerlo en la sombra, darles agua, o sea, bajar la temperatura. Si están súper deshidratados o si no están conscientes, tienen que ir al hospital o a una clínica y les dan un suero para hidratarse. Pero lo más importante es bajar la temperatura del cuerpo. Si alguien está sufriendo calambres por deshidratación, hay que hidratarse. Y se pueden prevenir hidratando durante el día. Y hay que hablar con los trabajadores también que hidratación no para en campo. O sea, durante toda la noche tienen que también estar hidratando en casa. Vimos muchos casos que los hombres llegan al campo y en la primera orina del día están súper deshidratados porque desde que salieron de trabajo, o sea, capaz que tomaron un vasito de jugo con su cena y esto fue solamente esto. Entonces llegan el próximo día súper recontra deshidratados. Entonces, o sea, están trabajando en calores extremos, entonces tienen que hidratarse las 24 horas del día, antes, durante y después de trabajo. Este sí ayudaría con los calambres y todos los otros síntomas de estrés térmico.
Muchas gracias, Ilana. Otra pregunta relacionada con esta, entra en portugués, pero sí lo entendí. Dice, ¿existe algún examen médico complementario que se pueda indicar un inicio de la insuficiencia renal por estrés térmico para ser realizado anualmente?
Sí y no. I'll do it in English since I came in Portuguese. We use as a biomarker creatinine. It is not a perfect biomarker, and it is not something that you can do one time. When we are doing evaluations over the course of a harvest season, we measure people's blood and urine for a whole host of indicators, but I think the most important for kidney health now is creatinine. We're developing some alternatives that are probably better predictors, but we're not ready yet with that. But we test them before the harvest, and then ideally you would test again in the middle of the harvest and again at the end of the harvest, because one point in time kind of gives you a snapshot, but it doesn't show you a change. And we are looking at small changes, because when you're talking about young, healthy, working men, their kidney function should remain stable over the course of time. And what we're seeing with these workers is that over the course of this harvest period, their kidneys are declining, clinically, maybe not in a relevant way, but when you look at them as healthy young men over the course of a very short amount of time, it is scary to see how much of their kidney function they are losing over the course of 3, 4, 5 months. So the short answer is yes, there are biological measures that you can look at. The longer answer is it's a little bit more complicated. I'm happy to talk you through that if that's something that your company is interested in.
Muchas gracias, Ilana. Hay otra pregunta de Gloria Eugenia González que dice, ¿el aumento de productividad en los estudios realizados fueron afectados únicamente por las medidas preventivas implementadas o se estudiaron otros factores al mismo tiempo para apoyar estas pausas en los trabajadores?
¿En español?
Sí.
Okay. El único cambio en las operaciones en este ingenio fue la intervención. Es el único cambio en sus operaciones. No cambiaron ni la semilla, o sea, ni la raza de caña, ni la manera de plantearlo, ni la manera de cortarlo. Lo único cambio era la intervención. Entonces se puede decir fácilmente que era la intervención que causó el aumento en la productividad. Basado en la ciencia también, porque por los fisiólogos y los médicos, o sea, nosotros humanos producimos mejor cuando estamos con cuerpos descansados. Entonces tiene sentido.
Ok, excelente, Ilana. Otra pregunta. Perdón. ¿Hay traductores? Gracias, Karina. Por cierto, acabamos de enviar una encuesta de satisfacción para esto, donde todos sus comentarios van a ser bienvenidos. Si pueden, por favor, responderla, la voy a volver a enviar para que podamos tener esto. Hay una pregunta más, donde dice que de cara a la falta de mano de obra, o sea, de falta de cortadores, ¿hay algún estudio de las alternativas? No tengo muy claro, Pablo Aguilar escribió esto, si tiene un poquito más fuera de esto, pero no sé si tú lo entiendes, Ilana, sobre más alternativas debido a la falta de obra. Me imagino que ahora que no tienen tanta gente es difícil ponerlos a descansar por periodos largos, o sea, algo así me imagino.
¿En español o en inglés? Español, ¿verdad?
En español fue.
Español. Mira, o sea, la falta de mano de obra, o sea, es difícil, o sea, y creo que es parte, o sea, es un trabajo muy duro y por generaciones ya la gente se están huyendo a hacer ese tipo de trabajo. La esperanza es de que si lo hacen, o sea, con intervenciones de salud ocupacional, o sea, con días más aceptables, o sea, más leve, capaz que atrae la gente y les convence quedarse porque no están llegando a su casa sintiendo enfermo. O sea, este es como una de las cosas que nuestros participantes nos comentó mucho, de que por 10 años de haber trabajado en caña, llegar a su casa al final del día con ganas de vomitar, y con esta intervención ya se sienten bien y se pueden tener la noche o la tarde con sus familias y se sienten bien. Entonces, les digo que tener esas intervenciones no va a solucionar la falta de mano de obra, pero a lo mejor caso se puede asegurar que no se van porque se están enfermando, o sea, se pueden retener lo que tienen, porque no se van a enfermar durante el transcurso de la zafra. Y repito, aunque suena raro que tomar más tiempo descansando, que van a alcanzar lo mismo o más. Yo sé que suena raro, pero la falta de mano de obra y la provisión de descansos no deben, o sea, no tiene que ver. O sea, con o sin falta de mano de obra hay que darles descansos. Y vas a ver, mejor salud en sus trabajadores y igual o mejor producción. En una intervención bien implementada. Si tienen intervenciones inadecuadas, no van a ver este efecto, el bono de mejor productividad. No sé si esta era la pregunta.
Me imagino que sí, y por lo pronto ya no tenemos más preguntas. Les hemos enviado, sí, dice Pablo que sí, que esa era la consulta que tenía. Ya no tenemos más preguntas por lo pronto. Les hemos enviado un enlace para responder a la encuesta sobre este webinar. Esperemos que haya sido de mucho provecho. Si ya no hay más preguntas para Ilana, queremos agradecerte de parte de Bonsucro todo el conocimiento que nos acabas de compartir. Realmente es muy interesante y es muy importante que podamos tomar acciones ahora que las temperaturas han cambiado todavía mucho más en corto tiempo. Entonces, esperemos que puedan implementar intervenciones. Como les repetí, esta sesión quedó grabada, va a quedar en nuestra página web a disposición de todos ustedes. Y también, pues queremos agradecer a los monopolios nórdicos del alcohol que nos han ayudado a patrocinar esta información, ¿verdad? Ya que ellos están muy interesados porque la caña de azúcar es uno de sus ingredientes o sus materias primas para la elaboración del alcohol, del ron, y pues ellos quieren apoyar a evitar estos riesgos en su cadena de suministro. Entonces, ojalá que se puedan con esta información lograr mejores condiciones de trabajo en todos los niveles. Les agradecemos muchísimo por su apoyo y pues muchísimas gracias también a todos aquellos que pudieron asistir a esta sesión. Estaremos brindando diferentes temas más adelante. Por lo pronto les agradecemos por su asistencia. Gracias, Ilana, y gracias a las traductoras por su ayuda.